We had moved into our new home, deep in the woods of Tennessee about a year ago. It was meant to be a fresh start, away from the noise and bustle of civilization, where isolation promised peace. But I quickly learned that the woods had a life of their own, a constant background of crickets, tree frogs, and cicadas that filled the nights. At first, the sounds were comforting, a reminder that we were not alone, that nature thrived all around us. One evening, I went outside to retrieve something from the car. My dog, usually eager to follow me anywhere, hesitated at the door. She looked up at me with a strange unease in her eyes, as if to say she wanted no part of whatever was outside. Ignoring her reluctance, I stepped out and closed the door behind me. As soon as I left the house, I noticed the quiet. The symphony of night creatures had stopped abruptly. The absence of noise was suffocating, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I shook off the feeling, convincing myself that the creatures had been spooked by something trivial. I walked toward the car, but as I neared it, I felt it, that undeniable sensation of being watched. I glanced around, trying to shake the paranoia, but saw nothing. Just as I opened the car door, a sudden rattle came from the hedge near the walkway. My first thought was that it was the rabbit I had seen earlier that day, until a heavy thud followed. A large rock, about the size of a cantaloupe, rolled from the direction of the hedge and landed a few feet away from me. My heart pounded as I reached for my gun, fully prepared to defend myself. I called out, warning whoever or whatever was lurking in the dark. Silence greeted me. After scanning the area and seeing no sign of movement, I reluctantly holstered the gun. I convinced myself it was a prank, probably some local kids testing the new neighbors. I turned back toward the house, but then I heard it. It was panting deep and raspy, like a large dog, but somehow wrong. Worse, it sounded like it was directly behind me. I spun around, gun drawn again, but saw nothing. The unease grew into a full-blown panic as I hurried back to the porch and slammed the door behind me. I spent the rest of the night wondering what had really happened out there, my nerves frayed. The weeks passed, and I managed to convince myself that it had been nothing more than my imagination. That was until one stormy night when my wife froze mid-conversation. She thought she heard something, a child crying for help. I hadn't heard anything, but her insistence was unsettling. She swore it sounded like our son's voice, and for a moment, she was ready to rush into the woods, even with the storm rolling in and her being 8 months pregnant. I had to practically drag her back inside, reminding her that our son was safely asleep in his bed. Still, her belief shook me. Something wasn't right, but I tried to dismiss it as stress or her own heightened nerves. A few months later, another unsettling incident occurred. My wife was standing at the open front door, staring into the dark woods. When I asked what she was doing, she told me she had heard a baby crying out there. Her certainty sent a chill down my spine. I tried to reason with her, explaining that it wasn't possible. There were no neighbors nearby, no babies to be abandoned in the woods. But she wouldn't respond, just stood there, fixated on the trees. I started to worry for her mental health. After giving birth just a month prior, I figured the isolation and exhaustion were playing tricks on her. But part of me wondered if something more was at play, something I couldn't explain. Our 3-year-old son began to act strangely as well. He'd be outside playing in front of the house, and then, without warning, he'd wander behind the shed. When I found him, he'd be pointing toward the woods, babbling excitedly about something he had seen. It was unsettling. I'd scold him for wandering off, but he'd just keep pointing, though I never saw anything out there. This wasn't the first time, and each instance left me more uneasy. It was as if something was drawing the children toward the trees. Then there were the late-night bangs. They started soon after my wife's unsettling behavior. Loud thuds would hit the walls of the house in the dead of night. I would grab my shotgun and rush outside, but I never found anything. The strangest part was that the walls being struck were 12 feet off the ground. That's too high for any normal person or animal to reach. Each time, the dogs, normally fierce barkers, would cower silently in their pen, too terrified to even whimper. The final straw came when my wife started hearing my voice when I wasn't even near her. She'd be alone in the house and suddenly hear what she swore was me. whispering her name or speaking in a low, indistinct murmur. She described it as so close, it felt like I was standing right behind her. These whispers, combined with the other incidents, began to make me question my own grasp on reality. One evening, while sighting in my rifle at the range behind the house, I heard a deep growl. It seemed to come from all around me, enveloping the woods. There was nothing in sight, yet the sound persisted, growing louder. I fired a few rounds into the target, more to scare off whatever it was than anything else. When the growling finally ceased, the woods fell into an unnatural silence, and I left, not telling my wife about the incident, unsure of what was real anymore. The most disturbing experience occurred months later, when my niece came to stay with us. She had been helping with the kids, and one night, after returning from a store run, I saw something that I could not explain. As the headlights swept over the woods, I noticed two eyes reflecting the light, too high for any animal. They glowed with a strange golden-green hue and then vanished. Later, while we were unloading the car, my dog began growling low. Her eyes locked on something across the street. I looked in the same direction and froze. There, between the trees, was something moving. At first, it was on all fours, but then it stood up. It was tall, impossibly tall, and moved with unnatural speed. Worse, it seemed to flicker in and out of view, as though it wasn't fully solid. It was like watching a shadow that refused to stay in focus. My blood ran cold. This thing, whatever it was watching us. The next morning, I measured the height where I had seen it standing. The eyes had been at least 9 feet off the ground, the space between them far too wide for any normal creature. I started researching, desperate for answers. That's when I came across stories of beings known as Glimmermen, creatures that could phase in and out of visibility, communicate telepathically, and mimic voices. Everything fell into place. The panting I had heard behind me, the cries my wife swore were our sons, the baby crying outside. This thing, whatever it was, had been watching us, imitating us, trying to lure us into the woods. Now, every night, I make sure the doors are locked tight, praying we never encounter it again. I live in West Virginia in a rather secluded part of the state, so I'm surrounded by trees and wilderness. I have lived here all my life and have heard many stories about Mothman and other cryptids like Skinwalkers and Wendigos. Being one of the oldest among my siblings, I dismissed these folk tales for years, but I was soon proven wrong. In the following days, I would be terrified, fearing for my life, as I was stalked by something supernatural. When I was 17, I was home alone for a good portion of my summer vacation. As it was getting late, I began turning off all the lights in our farmhouse. While doing this, I happened to look out the window toward the tree line. There, I saw what looked like a pair of glowing eyes. I took off my glasses, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. It seemed like I was imagining things, but little did I know, I wasn't. That thing would soon become the bane of my existence. The next morning, I woke up and went about my usual routine. I checked the barn, the cattle, and the horses. To my surprise, a few cows were missing. I told myself I must have miscounted the day before, but something else caught my attention. Some of the fencing near the cows was broken. I noticed tracks leading in and out of the pen, but they didn't belong to any animal I recognized, and I know my tracks. I figured it was a mix of cow, coyote, and wolf prints. Out of curiosity, I followed the tracks as far as I could, which led me about 50 feet into the woods. As I ventured into the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I looked around, but all I saw were trees. I told myself I was just tired and headed back to the farm. I quickly put up some temporary fencing with chicken wire to hold until my family returned. Later that evening, after a rough argument with my girlfriend, I decided to go for a walk to clear my head. I grabbed my phone, plugged in my headphones, and listened to music as I walked deeper into the woods. As night fell, I realized I had wandered too far and couldn't recognize my surroundings. I pulled out my phone and used the flashlight to guide my way back. While making my way back, my flashlight briefly caught something in the trees. It looked similar to what I had seen the night before, but it disappeared before I could get a closer look. Even though I was 17, I was freaked out. I quickened my pace, trying to leave the woods as fast as I could. Suddenly, a loud howling noise pierced through my music. Startled, I paused the music and took out my headphones. The howl came again. It was deep, scratchy, and nothing like a wolf or coyote. It was like someone trying to yell with a sore throat. I froze in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked around, shining my flashlight through the trees, but saw nothing. Everything was eerily silent. Then, a twig snapped just 10 feet away. That was when my fight or flight response kicked in, and I chose flight. I ran as fast as I could, despite not being very athletic. Fear gripped me, and my mind raced. After what felt like hours, I finally saw the edge of the forest and the farmhouse, still lit from the lights I hadn't turned off. As I jumped over the fence, I made the mistake of glancing back. To my horror, I saw a pair of glowing eyes. They were higher than any humans, and they were locked on me. I stumbled backward, tripping as I tried to keep eye contact with whatever it was. It didn't come any closer, stopping just at the tree line, but I could smell it. The stench was putrid, like a mix of rotting flesh and sulfur. I knew I wasn't the only one who saw or smelled the creature because the cows were panicking. After calming them down, I returned to the farmhouse, turned off the lights, and grabbed my binoculars. Looking back toward the tree line, I hoped what I had seen wasn't real, but there it was, those glowing eyes staring back at me. My heart leaped into my throat. I stumbled backward, slammed the door, and locked it. I rushed to my room, grabbed the shotgun from my closet, loaded it, and placed it under my bed for peace of mind. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw those eyes. Eventually, I must have dozed off because I woke up to the sound of the roosters and my alarm. I went through my routine, but this time I took my shotgun with me. When I reached the broken part of the fence, I noticed the temporary wire I had put up was torn, and blood stained the ground, probably from one of the cows it had taken. I still didn't know what I had seen, but I knew I would soon face it again. I ventured into the tree line about 10 feet and yelled, "I do not fear you. You cannot hurt me." My voice was firm, but in response, it let out a blood-curdling screech. I turned and ran back to the farm without looking back, a mistake I would regret that night. As night fell, I locked every door and window, then hid in my room with my shotgun. For about 10 minutes, there was silence. Then, I saw it closer this time, maybe 30 or 40 feet from the farmhouse. I knew it had seen me because we locked eyes. I quickly ducked down, and when I looked again, it was even closer and just 10 or 20 feet away. I opened the window and yelled at it, trying to show I wasn't afraid. It didn't move, just stared. I slammed the window shut, locked it, and pulled the curtains closed. Hours passed, or so it seemed, before I heard a loud banging on the front door. It wasn't just the door. There were noises all around me. Screeches, bangs, and inhuman sounds echoed through the house. Suddenly, every window downstairs shattered at once. In that moment, I thought, this is how I die. What happened next still feels like a dream. I heard animal-like noises coming from downstairs, the same blood-curdling howls and screeches. Then there were hoofsteps racing up the stairs. The smell hit me again, that same putrid stench of rotting flesh and eggs left in the sun. I nearly threw up. I covered my mouth, trying to stifle my breathing, but it didn't matter. It had my scent, found the room I was in. It banged against the door, and I ran to hold it shut, dropping my shotgun in the process. Kept banging and scratching, screaming with rage. I pushed with all my strength, but then I saw the dresser. I managed to shove it against the door, buying myself a little time, though I knew it wouldn't be enough. With my mind racing and heart pounding, I considered my options. Jump out of the third-story window or fight. I chose to fight. I waited, and when it finally burst through the door, I aimed my shotgun at its grotesque face. It was a horrific mix of human and deer, with antlers about 3 feet long. I pulled the trigger. I racked the shotgun and fired again, over and over. It howled in pain, and eventually, it retreated, leaving a trail of blood. I chased it down the stairs, through the hole it had made in my door, and into the tree line, firing my pistol at its retreating form. I stopped at the edge of the forest, yelling that I wasn't afraid. It howled one last time, not in anger, but in defeat. As I returned to the farmhouse, the rain began to fall. Strangely, nothing in the house was broken except for the door. When my parents returned the next day, I told them I had caused the hole in the door in a fit of rage. They believed me and I got yelled at, but I knew I had kept them safe from whatever that creature was. That was 2 years ago, back when I still lived on the farm. I've since moved out and am now attending college, but I stay in touch with my family. I always ask if they've seen any unusual tracks or heard any strange noises. To this day, I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for me to return, seeking revenge for what I did those years ago. I live in southern New Hampshire in a suburban area. Growing up, and even now, I lived in multiple places because of my parents' divorce. I'll start with the place I call Mom's house. Behind my mom's house were woods that we owned. Our property included about an acre of pine-dominated land, but the entire forest stretched over 20 acres. From within those woods, I could always see signs of civilization. Either the rows of suburban houses or a street on the far side that had no houses along it. These woods always felt comforting to me, like a warm presence, almost like a third parent. I loved spending time there. However, on the other side of the street was another forest, this one full of younger oak and birch trees, maybe 10 to 20 years old. One day, when I was around 9 or 10 years old, I was playing in the familiar woods behind my mom's house. Having explored all 20 acres of them, I decided it was time to check out the other forest across the street. The road was lined with woods on both sides, and further down the street was a nursing home. As soon as I entered the unfamiliar forest, my instincts told me to leave. I immediately felt as though I was being watched. Despite this unsettling sensation, my curiosity got the better of me, and I ventured deeper into the trees. I came upon a circular area where the forest seemed thinner, though it wasn't exactly a clearing. Ahead of me was a pile of trash, not anything related to drugs, but old food containers and discarded clothing. At this point, my inner voice was practically screaming at me to leave, so I turned and ran back through the woods as fast as I could until I reached the road. Once I was back in the nice woods, I felt completely fine again. A few years later, maybe 4 or 5 years after that first experience, I decided to revisit the other forest. By then, I had grown a bit bored of the woods behind my mom's house. This time, I brought a knife in a holster, just in case, and kept my hand on it the entire time. Once again, I felt like I was being watched, and that same nagging feeling to leave returned. I never found that thinner area of the forest this time, but I did stumble upon something else. Shoes. Dozens of old, decaying shoes scattered throughout the area. There were shoes of all kinds, nice shoes, small shoes, women's running shoes, baby shoes, all in varying states of decay. In addition to the shoes, I found a camping stove, an old propane canister, and food trash. I also found a camping pot, which I picked up and took home since I needed one for my own camping trips. I still have it. But it was the shoes that truly unsettled me. They were everywhere, and it didn't make sense. I pressed on and eventually came to a steep embankment, about 35 degrees, which I climbed. At the top was a residential area with a thick fence surrounding it, and none of the houses had gates. The trash and shoes were too deep in the forest to have been casually thrown there by homeowners. By then, I was thoroughly spooked, so I decided to leave. I was deeply unsettled, which was unusual for me, given that I'm usually quite stoic. However, the most frightening experience I've had happened at my dad's house, or rather, in his neighborhood. His neighborhood was tightly packed with houses and thin strips of forest, mostly huge pine trees, separated the homes. It was technically in a city, though I would occasionally see deer or even a moose, which is very rare in this area. One evening, just as dusk was falling, I was out walking my dog. It was almost fully dark, and the streetlights had come on. I was nearing a turn in my usual walking route, passing by a small pine and oak forest, when I noticed something in the woods. I froze in terror. My gut twisted in the most horrible way, as though I just received the worst news of my life. I saw what looked like a deer standing on its hind legs. It had a fat, white belly and brown fur on its back, and it was staring right at me. At first, I could only see its belly. When I tried to focus on its face, I couldn't make it out. My eyesight is normally good, and I should have been able to see it, but it was as if my central vision had suddenly been switched off, leaving only my peripheral vision. The creature seemed to blend in with the forest. I could clearly see its body, but its head was impossible to make out. Then, it suddenly dropped to the ground, got on all fours, turned, and ran off toward a fence. On the other side of that fence was a dump. The patch of forest it had been standing in was only about 50 by 50 feet, and it must have jumped the 6-foot chain-link fence to get in and out. Strangely, my dog, a hound with a keen sense of smell, had noticed nothing. It wasn't until the creature ran away that my dog perked up and looked in its direction. I could hear it running, and that's when I turned around and walked back home, shaken but relieved to be leaving. I grew up in the Huron region of Ontario, which, for those unfamiliar, is about a 3-hour drive directly west of Toronto, situated along the shore of Lake Huron. It's not far from where the infamous tales of the Black Donnellys took place, for those interested in dark history. While I was in high school, there was a teacher who often shared his experiences from a small, forested area called Lob's Bush. At the time, I wasn't too familiar with it, but many locals knew it as a haunted place where people had unexplainable, yet eerily similar, encounters. What made this teacher's stories even more intriguing was his firm belief that he didn't believe in the paranormal. He would tell us what happened, but always concluded with, "I don't believe it, can't explain it, I'm just telling you what happened." A few years later, in the winter of 2017, after having graduated from high school and started my first year of university, I came back to my hometown during winter break to visit family and reconnect with friends. If you've experienced small-town life, you'll know that one of the typical pastimes for teens like us was to stock up on cheap reservation cigarettes, hop into a beat-up car, and drive around smoking, chatting, and listening to terrible music until either the gas tank or our supply of smokes ran out. Most of us were between 16 and 18 years old at the time, so this was the most exciting way we could think to spend our time. On this particular break, I was thrilled to see my friends again after a few months away at university. After a few hours of driving around, catching up, and enjoying the freedom from schoolwork, we decided to stop at a random bush trail so some of us could smoke weed. As we walked down the trail, I started to feel a shift in the atmosphere. I didn't want to ruin the mood, so I kept my thoughts to myself, but I felt a sense of unease, as if something was watching us and didn't want us there. I couldn't shake the feeling and kept glancing over my shoulder, checking to make sure we weren't being followed. The trail was surrounded by new trees that curled overhead, creating the impression that we were walking into the mouth of a giant creature. We only made it a few hundred meters down the trail when we noticed that the calm night was quickly turning into a winter storm. Agreeing that we should head back before the weather worsened, we retraced our steps toward the car. By the time we got there, the wind was howling, and the snow made it difficult to see even a few feet ahead. We piled into the car and started driving toward the nearest town, intending to wait out the storm at a friend's place. However, as the snow continued to fall heavily, we misjudged a turn and slid into a ditch. After some back-and-forth frustrations and half-hearted attempts at getting the car out, we ended up stuck for 5 hours before local police rescued us. During that time in the ditch, I finally mentioned the unsettling feeling I'd had while walking in the woods. Surprisingly, everyone else admitted they'd felt the same but hadn't spoken up. Then our friend, who had been driving and was familiar with the area, casually revealed that we had been walking through Lob's Bush. Fast forward to the following year, during my second semester reading week, I was back home with my friends. We decided to revisit Lob's Bush, as none of us had returned since our misadventure. The weather was warmer, and the night was clear, with the moon illuminating our path. This time, as we walked, I recognized some of the landmarks I'd missed the first time. Without the oppressive snow and wind, the forest felt much less intimidating, and I began to enjoy the walk, chatting and laughing with my friends. After a while, we came to a clearing where the trees parted to reveal a field bathed in moonlight. On one side of the trail, a small stream cut through the grass, creating a peaceful, almost picturesque scene. We found a spot to stop, and as we were settling in, one friend suddenly pulled out a Roman candle and decided it would be fun to set it off. As the fireworks shot into the air, they pointed it in various directions, sending sparks flying across the field and toward the woods. The shots were mostly harmless, but one of them ricocheted into the woods, and within seconds, a blood-curdling scream erupted from the darkness. We all froze, unsure of what we had just heard. The scream lasted an unnervingly long time, rising in pitch and volume. It was unlike any animal I'd ever heard, a deep, primal roar that rattled my chest. As soon as the scream stopped, one of my friends yelled for us to run, and we bolted toward the field. We didn't stop running until the scream started again, this time even louder and angrier. Whatever it was moving toward us and fast. We ran as hard as we could, eventually breaking through the woods and into the open field. The scream cut off abruptly as we reached the edge of the forest. Shaken but relieved to be out of the bush, we made our way back to the car, too unnerved to speak much about what had just happened. Once we got back to the road and saw the car in the distance, we finally began to relax. We piled into the car, started the engine, and were just about to pull away when one of my friends in the front seat screamed for the driver to go. Without hesitation, the driver reversed and sped off. As we drove past the woods, I glanced back, and for a moment, I saw two large, reflective eyes staring back at me from the darkness. They were set far enough into the woods that I couldn't make out the figure behind them, but I could tell that whatever it was far larger than a human. The sight of those eyes shook me to my core. I felt like prey, and whatever was watching us was the predator. It knew we were there, and it had been watching us the whole time. Later that night, once we had calmed down, we talked about the experience. We all heard the same screams, felt the same sense of dread, and two of us had seen the eyes. None of us could explain what had happened, but we all agreed that it was something beyond our understanding. After that night, I spent a long time researching what we might have encountered. I eventually came to believe it was something akin to a skinwalker, a shape-shifting entity from indigenous folklore. I shared the story with a few indigenous elders I knew, and they all agreed that it sounded like a skinwalker. Hearing similar stories from them only confirmed what I had felt in those woods, that there are things out there we can't explain, things that defy logic or reason. That night in Lob's Bush changed the way I think about the world. It opened my mind to possibilities I'd never considered and made me question everything I thought I knew about the supernatural. My family recently bought a beautiful but overgrown piece of land in the Kootenays of British Columbia. It's a wonderful place, but my dad is frustrated by the amount of work needed to make our land comfortable for living. I personally love our little pocket of untouched nature, but I'm getting off topic. I thought it was strange that the previous owners seemed to be in a rush to sell the land, but I attributed that to the uneven ground and abundance of vegetation. My family brought their trailer to the land, and we were staying in it while I set up a small tent nearby since there wasn't enough room for me. Soon after we started staying there, my dad and I were comfortably sitting around our fire pit, stargazing and listening to the sounds of the land when we began to hear the shrieks of something that was certainly inhuman, yet unlike any animal either of us had ever encountered. It was a shrill, guttural growl, extremely drawn out and loud. My first guess was that a bear or cougar had gotten cornered, but listening more closely quickly shattered that assumption. I began to distinguish the growl of a small bear, but that wasn't the source of the strange shriek. It soon sounded like a bear was cornering something, and the threatened creature was trying to make a last-ditch escape while screaming in pain. Now, I know you're probably thinking it must have been a cougar or something similar, but I have heard a cougar in a fight before. This was not a cougar. Its shrieks and howls sounded almost demonic. Soon after the noises stopped, my dad and I decided it would be best to head to bed. While lying in my tent, I started to hear the unmistakable sound of a large creature roaming around our site. After a moment, I heard it settle into place, almost like it was sitting down and getting comfortable. I began to worry that the unidentifiable creature from earlier was stalking me until I worked up the courage to peek out of my tent's window. In the spot where I heard the creature approach, I saw not a horrifying monstrosity, but a beautiful black bear. I would normally be afraid upon seeing this. However, when I made eye contact with the bear, I felt an overwhelming sense of safety. I know this sounds crazy, but it almost felt like the bear was watching over us, protecting us from something. Soon after noticing the bear, I heard the blood-curdling screech of the unidentifiable creature, much closer now. When the bear heard this, it tensed up, rose to its feet, and began to growl menacingly. Only a moment after the bear began to growl, I heard a much larger creature than the bear run off in the opposite direction. I turned my head to see where the noise was coming from and caught a glimpse of an incredibly large deer-like animal. I didn't get a good look at it, but I remember seeing thin, skeletal, long pale arms and legs that ended with hooves. It was also covered in a dark, blood-like substance, implying that it had been injured recently. When I saw this, my breath caught in my throat, and I couldn't force myself to look away. I watched the trees sway and break where it was running. Then it stopped a considerable distance away from our land and let out one more shriek. The few birds that were awake in the area flew away in fear, and I shuddered. I looked back to the bear, and it was once again sitting, gazing at me with its kind, protective eyes. I have never been more grateful to have a bear living nearby, and I no longer fear them. Instead, I respect them. I don't have any family and I'm socially awkward, so every Christmas, I stay at a cabin I own just outside Robert Lee, Texas. I usually spend 2 weeks there every Christmas because I can't stand all the festive nonsense that's everywhere. Last year was no different. It's important to note that I'd never had a coyote problem while staying at the cabin, though I was always faintly aware they were around. My Labrador usually alerts me if they come too close, but it doesn't happen often since they tend to keep their distance. Anyway, I was staying at the cabin and had been there for a few days. I'd been having trouble with work and was looking forward to the time away from everything. On the third night, Turing started barking to go out. Thinking he needed to go to the bathroom, I let him out. After a brief few minutes, he came back whimpering, as if something had scared him. If you know my dog, you'd know he isn't the type to get scared easily. He's the kind of dog that would try to pick a fight with the coyotes, so this was unexpected and surprising. Stupidly, I stepped onto the cabin porch to see if anything was outside. At first, I didn't see anything, until I noticed 2 glowing eyes staring right at me. I just stood there, trying to focus on what it was, when it stepped out of the darkness into the light. It looked like a coyote, but its skin appeared to be rotting. Then the smell hit me, and I nearly threw up. My body seemed to move back on its own. I backed into the cabin, closed the door, and locked it. I shut the blinds on all the windows and turned most of the lights off. I would occasionally glance out the window, and the coyote was still there. It stayed there the entire night. By the time the coyote disappeared during the day, I had almost forgotten about it. The day went by normally. I drove into town to pick up a few supplies and spent the day relaxing with a few beers. Other than occasionally feeling like I was being watched, everything seemed normal. But when night fell, that's when the real incident happened. It must have been around 1 in the morning when I was woken up by a scratching sound at my window. First, I was confused. There weren't any trees close enough to scratch my bedroom window, so I immediately knew something was wrong. I got up to investigate. I opened the curtains and screamed. Standing on the other side was the same coyote, but this time, it had a disturbingly human smile on its face. I ran out of the room and grabbed my hunting rifle from the gun cabinet. After checking it was loaded, I looked out the door window and saw several coyotes, all with the same rotting skin as the one from the night before. Then I heard the glass in the bedroom break. I rushed over, expecting to find the coyote inside, but instead, there was a rock. That didn't make any sense. Since when did coyotes start throwing rocks? And that's when I heard it. Laughter. The coyotes were laughing at me. The rest of the night was more of the same. They'd throw rocks, I'd fire a few shots, and they'd laugh at me. As soon as morning came, they left, almost like they had never been there. I packed up and left as soon as I could. I haven't been back since. I sold the cabin a few months ago, and I'm planning to spend this Christmas with my girlfriend's family. I don't think I'll ever forget that laughter. Several years ago, just before COVID hit, I had a strange encounter with what I believe was a skinwalker. At the time, I had decided to buy an old ranch to fix up and eventually retire to. I'm only 32 now, so I've still got many years before retirement, but I wanted to start early. The house on the land was in terrible shape, having been neglected for decades. It needed to be rebuilt, but that didn't bother me. I wanted to build something more modern and planned for it to be completely off-grid. My first night on the property was spent in an old RV I had rented from my parents. I sat outside as the sun set, sipping on some lukewarm beer while watching the stars. Throughout the day and most of the night, I heard coyotes in the distance, somewhere north of my land. I didn't think much of it. If they got too close, I figured I could just head into the RV until they moved along. I was armed, but I didn't see the need to waste ammunition unless absolutely necessary. Things took a strange turn when I heard a blood-curdling screech coming from the direction of the coyotes. It was a sound that's hard to describe, something that seemed to pierce right through me, almost as if it came straight from the depths of hell. It sent a shiver down my spine, and I decided to head inside and call it a night. Just as I was about to settle in, I heard knocking on the side of the RV. There wasn't supposed to be anyone else out here. My nearest neighbor was 6 kilometers away. The knocking continued, moving to the door, and it sounded like someone was knocking normally, as though asking to come in. Somehow, I knew that opening the door would be a mistake, that if I did, I might disappear. I quietly grabbed my shotgun and made sure it was loaded. When I looked out the window, there was no one there, yet the knocking persisted. Then, I started hearing someone or something whispering my name, telling me to let them in over and over again. I kept peeking out the windows and caught glimpses of something moving just beyond the light. Sometimes it seemed like a person standing on 2 legs. Other times it looked like an animal darting around on 4 legs. I was confused, trying to rationalize it as someone playing a prank with their dog, but it didn't explain the whispering. Then, the knocking came again, louder this time, and when I checked, there was something standing there. It was about 8 feet tall, completely black, with glowing red eyes that exuded pure malice. It stared right at me, repeating the same phrases over and over. "Let me inside. Let me help you." And "you seem lost." But in a jumbled, eerie way. I was paralyzed with fear for what felt like an eternity. But finally, I raised my shotgun and fired through the door window. Whatever it was didn't seem bothered. It just kept repeating, "Let me help you." I aimed my shotgun again, but before I could fire a second shot, it turned and walked away. As soon as it was out of sight, I heard the most horrifying, deafening screech that I'll never forget. I spent the rest of the night awake, clutching my shotgun in one hand and a bottle of Jack Daniels in the other. The next morning, I did a perimeter check around the RV. Strangely, there were no tracks from whatever I had seen. I found coyote and human tracks, but nothing that matched what I had encountered. Couldn't have been either of those. Since then, I built the house and haven't had another encounter, something I'm grateful for every day. I had a peculiar experience in Congaree National Park, just outside of Columbia last winter, that led me to explore various online communities. The park features a stunning boardwalk winding through the swamps and cypress forests. If you could see an image of it, the story might come alive even more. I used to live in Columbia, South Carolina, and frequently visited the park, so I was quite familiar with the area. Often, I would jump the fence and stroll along the boardwalk at night. It's incredibly peaceful to wander through the swamp, surrounded by the sounds of wildlife. There were never any rangers or guards on duty after hours, so I was always alone. During my last visit in October 2021, I was taking my usual nighttime walk with a flashlight in hand. It's worth mentioning that the sounds of insects and frogs were quite loud, but suddenly everything went silent as I ventured about a mile in. I thought I heard my wife calling me from the trail ahead, but she wasn't there. I was all alone and she was out of town. Then I heard the sound of water sloshing to my right, but my flashlight revealed nothing. I dismissed it as fatigue and continued walking. Shortly after, the wildlife sounds resumed, and everything seemed normal again. However, about 15 minutes later, the eerie silence returned, and I heard the water sloshing on my left side, this time more deliberate, almost as if someone were walking. I was in a dense area of cypress trees, unable to see more than 20 feet in front of me, when I heard my wife's voice again. Once again, she wasn't with me and was out of town, certainly not traversing a swamp at 1 a.m. I caught a fleeting glimpse of what appeared to be a human silhouette moving between the trees, but it looked off. It was very thin, pale, and taller than me at 6 feet. That sight pushed me to leave in a hurry. I sprinted almost 2 miles back to my truck and didn't slow down until I heard the familiar sounds of wildlife again. This boardwalk is set deep within a swamp, far from any urban area. I can't imagine anyone wandering through the water at night without a light, let alone a person or creature that size moving bipedally. I've spent my life outdoors and have never encountered an animal like that. To clarify, I wasn't under the influence or sleep deprived. I just appreciate the tranquility of the woods at night. The experience shook me enough that I turned to Reddit, diving into various stories on this and other related communities. I'm convinced I encountered a crawler or a Wendigo or some entity that can mimic voices. It's hard to believe a random person would be stumbling through the swamp, miles from civilization, sounding like my wife, but then again, this is South Carolina. Back in 2019, I remember there being a significant uproar about unknown creatures roaming the forest, like Bigfoot and Skinwalkers. But this story isn't about them. It's about probably one of the scariest things I've ever heard of, the Wendigo. A few months after my friend Jacob mentioned this uproar, I went to see him since I had been away enlisted in the United States Marines. After being discharged, one of the first things I did was visit him. We were having a good time when he suggested going to a little hangout spot his now ex-girlfriend used to take him to when they wanted to escape for a few hours. I thought it was a good idea, so I grabbed my gun, and we headed out to this extremely secluded area, where we started messing around on an old dock that looked like it had been forgotten. It was poorly maintained, and some of the boards were almost completely rotted through. About 30 minutes into our shenanigans, Jacob brought up the topic of the Wendigo. The name sounded a bit scary, even for me. Curious, I asked him about it, and he explained that if someone went into the woods and said, "Wendigo" 3 times, they would encounter the scariest creature imaginable. I decided to call his bluff and challenged him to prove it, a decision I would later regret. We began walking down a narrow path that led deep into the thick woods near the Alabama state line. After about 20 minutes, we agreed we had reached a good spot. It's worth noting that it had been raining heavily for the past few days, so the ground was completely saturated with water. Jacob dared me to say it, and I stood in silence, the forest around us almost quiet, save for the tall pines swaying in the wind above. Reluctantly, I slowly began to say it, "Wendigo, Wendigo, Wendigo." Then nothing happened. I felt a silent relief wash over me. Nothing had occurred. One thing about Jacob and me is that we loved proving each other wrong. In our 10 years of friendship, I think it was one of the first times I had succeeded. As we exchanged playful banter, a noise suddenly emerged in the distance. With the reflexes I had from the Marines, I instinctively turned toward the source of the sound, which quickly escalated into more noises. I began to move closer and soon saw a few coyotes running across the path about 30 feet in front of us. I let out another sigh of relief, but it didn't last long. I could sense that something was off. I didn't know what was wrong, but I felt it was time for Jacob and me to leave. As we turned to exit the woods, suddenly a tall pine tree began to groan and creak as it started to fall. In a moment of pure instinct, I shoved Jacob forward just as the tree crashed down through the branches and landed right between us. Jacob let out a cry of terror as the tree fell, and I jumped over it to reach him. I could feel his heart pounding as I grabbed him by his shirt and pulled him to his feet. He was still terrified, practically in tears as I urged him to move quickly. I spun him around hard, causing him to fall to his knees. I quickly helped him up, and we both began sprinting down the path in the direction we had come from. Neither of us dared to look back. I was sprinting through the woods when a familiar sound reached my ears. It was the voice of Jacob's younger sister, Olivia. He turned and tried to get past me, screaming for her. I stopped him, insisting that it wasn't her. Just then, another pine tree began to buckle. I saw it just in time to tackle Jacob to the ground as we narrowly avoided being crushed. I shouted at him to get out of there, urging him to run. As I yelled, I pulled my gun from my waistband and aimed it down the trail in the direction we had come from. Jacob reached the opening of the trail and turned back, noticing that I was still aiming my gun down the path. He urged me to hurry and get out of there. I turned and began sprinting toward him. When I reached the clearing, a good 50 feet ahead, I turned, and Jacob and I both saw it. It's the creature we had inadvertently summoned. The Wendigo stood about 9 feet tall on its hind legs. There was hardly any meat on its bones. It had spindly legs and even skinnier arms. The skin was a pale white, almost like that of a vampire. But what struck me most were its eyes. It was vibrant blue, almost like lightsaber blue for those who have seen Star Wars. Overwhelmed with fear, I raised my gun and fired at the Wendigo. Jacob, not sticking around to see if I had hit it, turned and ran toward the car. I followed suit as he passed me. That was my first encounter with this so-called Wendigo, and I pray almost every night that I never have to face something that terrifying again. I was about 12 at the time. One day, after getting off the school bus, I walked home. By the time I got there, I was hot and needed to use the bathroom. Our house was small, one of those 1950s-style brick homes you'd find in the rural southeast. It had 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen, and a living room. It was about 1,000 square feet, so there weren't many places for anyone to hide inside. I walked in through the back door, set my books down, and headed straight for the bathroom. It was a sunny, peaceful day, and I was just sitting there when I heard someone call my name from outside the door. The voice seemed to come from the end of the short hallway that ran down the middle of the house. It called me by my childhood nickname and sounded like my mom, except my mom was at work and I was completely alone in the house. I froze, unsure of what to do. I was convinced there had to be a burglar in the house. I finished as quickly as possible, then made my way to the bathroom door, bracing myself for what I might find. I looked down the hallway to my right and left, but no one was there. Scared, I ran outside and waited until my mom came home. When she pulled into the driveway, I told her what had happened. She checked the house, but no one was there. She told me I was just hearing things and that it was all in my head. Maybe it was. Fast forward to when I was in the 7th or 8th grade. I was home alone again in that same house. My parents were gone for the day, and it was a cold, dreary weekend. I decided to get some homework done. I sat down at the kitchen table with my books and notebook. To my left was the hallway. If you walked down it, the bathroom was on the right, followed by my bedroom. On the left were my parents' bedroom and my brother's room. My brother, being much older, was rarely home. The house was completely silent. The weather outside was bleak, and the limited windows meant the house had that dim, hazy lighting you get on overcast days, adding to the quiet and stillness. I was focused on my homework and enjoying the solitude. Then, from the end of the hallway to my left, I heard a woman say my name again, clear as day, using my childhood nickname. My blood ran cold. Slowly, I looked down the hallway, but there was nothing there. Fear took over, and I quietly closed my books, grabbed my jacket, and ran out the back door without looking back, tears welling up in my eyes. I made my way to the standalone garage out back and sat on my dad's red lawnmower, keeping my eyes on the back door to see if anyone came out of the house. But I knew it was impossible for anyone to be inside, as no one had been home all day. Still, I sat there shivering for what felt like hours until my parents finally got home. I ran to them as soon as they pulled into the driveway and told them what had happened. They checked the house again and found nothing, insisting it was all in my imagination. Today, my mother still lives in that house, and I live with her now to help out since she's elderly. My father passed away several years ago. Mom often tells me how she used to hear my dad calling her name from the living room. She'd go in to ask what he wanted, only to find that he hadn't called for her at all. Even now, she insists it's just her imagination. One day, I wasn't feeling well, so I stayed in bed while everyone else went to work. I had just fallen asleep when my subconscious picked up on a slight scraping sound, like a door sticking. I sat up to listen but didn't hear anything. Only when I laid back down and closed my eyes did the sound return, with scraping against wood. The house was very old, dating back to the mid-1800s, so I figured it might be the downstairs screen door. I got up and stood at the top of the balcony. Looking down, there was nothing. I went back to bed, closed my eyes, and drifted off again. At some point during my sleep, I felt a hand gently caressing my back. I smiled, thinking my husband had come home early. I mumbled something, half turning to thank him, but when I looked, there was no one there. Startled, I jumped out of bed, calling for my husband as I ran downstairs, nearly tripping in my rush. Grabbing the railing to steady myself, I paused, shocked that the house was completely empty. I stood there, listening intently, when suddenly I heard a door upstairs squeak open. Fear gripped me, and I rushed outside, sitting on the porch swing to wait for my husband to get home. 3 hours later, he pulled into the driveway. When he saw me wrapped in a comforter outside, he hurried over, asking if I was okay. I explained the eerie sounds I had heard, the scraping wood and the feeling of someone rubbing my back. He looked at me strangely, told me to stay outside, and quickly went inside to check. Worried about him, I followed. We went upstairs, and he checked every corner, but there was nothing. Relieved, I sighed, and he suggested I had probably just been dreaming. I wasn't so sure, but I agreed and climbed back into bed, letting him cover me up. He said he'd be downstairs and to call if I needed anything. I relaxed, hearing him moving around in the kitchen, and drifted off again. I don't think I'd been asleep for long when the scraping sound returned, louder this time, waking me instantly. Frozen in place, I felt panic rising. Just as I was about to scream, the bedroom light flipped on, and there stood my husband. He motioned for me to stay quiet and come to him quickly. I crawled out of bed and ran to him, and he whispered for me to go downstairs. I refused. He grabbed his gun, and that's when I noticed the small attic door was slightly open. I gasped as he approached it, yanking the door open. Suddenly, a freezing gust of wind rushed out, enveloping us both. The attic door slammed shut, and I screamed. My husband jumped in shock, grabbed my hand, and we both bolted out of the room, racing down the stairs. Exhausted and terrified, we decided to sleep downstairs on the sofa bed for the night. I couldn't fall asleep, too scared to close my eyes. I kept checking the clock. It was 3 a.m., the so-called witching hour. My heart pounded as I waited. Sure enough, I could hear the attic door creaking open and closed, over and over again, by itself. I silently cried in fear, knowing I'd be left alone in the morning when my husband left for work. At 5 a.m., my husband told me he wasn't leaving me alone in the house. He decided to take the day off so we could look for another place to live. I cried with relief and hugged him tightly. Thankfully, we found a new house that same day and hired movers to handle everything from the old place. I refused to step foot in that house again. Once we were settled in our new home, we had family over. Someone asked why we had moved, and we explained that the bedroom in our old house was haunted. They looked shocked and asked what had happened. I recounted the strange sounds, the feeling of someone rubbing my back, and the attic door slamming shut. Everyone was stunned. Then my brother asked if that was all that had happened. My husband came over and wrapped his arm around me. He admitted there was something he hadn't told me at the time. He explained that when he had heard the scraping sounds upstairs, he rushed up, knowing I was alone. When he reached the top of the landing, he saw a man standing next to me. The moment he flipped the light on, the figure vanished. That's when he decided we couldn't stay in that house any longer. Even now, I still have nightmares about that bedroom and the man standing next to me, rubbing my back. The thought of it still chills me to the core. Me and my older sibling were staying at home. We lived in a small town in Ohio, with fewer people than the number in my mom's graduating class from the city we came from. My sibling was grounded, and both the house phone and their personal phone were locked in my dad's gun safe, which neither of us knew the combination to. The reason for being grounded was something silly and arbitrary. I can't quite remember why. Our grandparents lived down the street, and my great-grandmother had a small house built on their property so she could be independent but still close by. My parents told us they were going to check on my great-grandmother since my grandparents were out of town, and they'd be back soon so we could order pizza. That sounded good to 7-year-old me and my 15-year-old sibling. We played video games for a while, starting to get hungry and wonder when our parents would be back. After about 2 hours, there was a knock on the door. I went downstairs, pretty excited, thinking it was the food, and my sibling followed a little behind after saving the game. I walked up to the door, which had a large window in it, and it wasn't my parents. Instead, there was a very tall, lean white guy with short black hair and scruffy facial hair. He looked about 25 years old. It was jarring because everyone knew everyone in this small town, and I had no idea who this guy was. I held up my finger, signaling 1 second, and closed the curtain. I turned to see my siblings staring at the door in disbelief because they had seen him too. Within seconds, the knocking turned to pounding, and then the doorknob started shaking and rattling. Terrified, and with no way to call our parents, my sibling grabbed my hand and ran me into the kitchen. They grabbed a knife, but I distinctly remember it breaking in their hand, so they quickly grabbed a different one. We hid in the laundry room, holding each other tightly. We could still hear the banging and pounding, and after what felt like hours, though it was probably just 5 minutes, the front door opened. One thing about my sibling is that they have always been ready to protect me at a moment's notice. They were prepared to jump up with their crappy kitchen knife and defend me the moment that guy got too close. Instead, my mom rounded the corner, holding 2 pizza boxes and looking completely confused as to why her 2 kids were crumpled in a heap of tears on the floor. We both jumped up and told her about the man outside, but she just laughed. My dad was outside talking to him. Apparently, the guy was asking about buying the broken-down car that had been sitting in our driveway for a few months. He was a mechanic. My mom felt terrible but found the situation a bit amusing. She went out to talk to the man, and he said he felt bad for scaring us. We were given hugs and promised that the phones wouldn't be locked away the next time they left us alone. We spent the rest of the night eating pizza with choked sobs. But something still bothers me, even though it didn't at the time. It's something I never really thought about before. Why would a grown man pound on the door like that, shaking the handle, trying so hard to get into a house where either the parents weren't home, or the youngest kid had clearly signaled to go get them? Why would someone want to talk about a car that didn't have a "for sale" sign on it, and so late at night, around 9 or 10 p.m.? My parents brushed it off so lightly, but something in my gut tells me that's not how adults act. I don't think I really want to know what would have happened if my parents hadn't come home when they did. I honestly feel like something has followed me my whole life. The first time I was truly terrified was when I was a teenager. I couldn't sleep without the lights on and some noise, either music or the TV, because I would often see a face hovering in the space above my door. One night, I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. I turned the lights off, but of course, I saw the face again. I had to go to the bathroom and was trying to work up the courage to get out of bed. I wrapped a quilt over my head, thinking it would somehow protect me. My apartment was tiny, and the bathroom was only about 5 steps from my bedroom, so it should have been an easy trip. I rushed out of my room, but as I tried to leave, something grabbed onto my blanket. I was terrified, pulling and struggling, until I finally felt whatever it was let go. I ran into the bathroom, collapsed on the floor, and just cried for what felt like an hour. When I finally pulled myself together and returned to my room, I turned the light on and looked around. There was nothing in the path I had just run that could have caused what I felt. A chill ran down my spine. Years later, I was living in a different city with some roommates, and I had just taken in my grandpa's dog. I had this rule for myself. If I got scared but the dog didn't react, then I could dismiss it as nothing. One night, I thought I had a nightmare about something standing in my doorway. We all slept with our doors closed, and my roommate with the cat always kept it in her room at night. As I slowly woke up from the nightmare, I tried to calm myself down, but I realized I couldn't move. I was staring at my closed door, but something about it seemed darker than usual. Just then, my dog started growling, a deep, threatening sound that broke me out of my paralysis. I sat up and grabbed her, but she kept growling for a few minutes. I finally got up, turned the lights on, and tried to settle down. The next day, I told my roommate about what had happened, and she got really quiet. She told me that she had experienced strange things with spirits her whole life and felt she had a spiritual connection to help get rid of them. She also admitted she had been feeling a bad presence for a few days, and that it had all seemed to come to a head the previous night. That left me trembling. She came into my room later that day and did a powerful prayer, commanding whatever it was to leave. After that, I never had any more issues in that house. My dog never acted like that again either. Even though I experienced other strange things after I left that place, I genuinely believe she did something that stopped it from coming back to her space. To this day, I have trouble sleeping when I'm alone, and I still rely on my animals to let me know if there's really something to be afraid of. I once had something very strange happen to me, and it still scares me. My husband and I had just woken up, the sun was up, and he had gone downstairs for a moment while I sat on the bed, scrolling through my phone. Suddenly, I started feeling strange. I couldn't quite place the feeling, but it kept intensifying, so I thought maybe I was about to pass out. I decided to lie down and put my phone beside me. That's when I heard a weird zapping noise, and my head still felt off. We had an electric blanket, so I sat up, grabbed my phone to use as a flashlight, and uncovered myself, thinking maybe there was an exposed wire that could be shocking me. But everything looked fine. The blanket and the wire were in perfect condition. Still, I pushed it off the bed just to be safe, lay back down, and put my phone down again, though the strange feeling lingered. Out of nowhere, someone with really long hair appeared, leaning over me, just to the left of my head. My husband has long hair, so for a split second, I thought he had come back upstairs without me noticing. But this was not my husband. I was so terrified. I brought my hands up to the sides of my face and tried to scream, but I couldn't move, and no sound came out. I struggled so hard to move because I desperately wanted to get away from whatever that thing was. The scariest part was when I raised my hands, I balled my fists, and, in my right hand, I grabbed a chunk of this person's or being's hair. I could feel the hair tangled between my fingers. I couldn't speak or move, but then I heard my husband coming up the stairs. As he got closer, everything started to fade away, and the figure vanished. As soon as I was able, I told my husband to turn on the light the moment he came through the doorway, and I sat up. I was terrified. I knew I had been awake, so I was confused and shaken. My husband knew I was awake too, which confirmed what I felt. I had been sitting up on my phone. I was not asleep. A few years later, I was diagnosed with epilepsy. I've never had another experience like that, not before or since. I'm not sure if it was a seizure that I didn't recognize, but none of my seizures ever made me see or feel something that wasn't there. It still doesn't make sense to me, and to this day it terrifies me. I was 14. It was an average night, around 9 p.m. My little cousin and I were at his house since I was babysitting for the night. My mom and aunt were out shopping while my dad and uncle were at the movie theater. We were sitting there, just watching TV, but I started to feel strange, like something was off. I couldn't quite figure out what it was, so I just kept watching TV with my cousin, hoping the feeling would pass. The uneasiness stayed with me, though, so I got up and decided to lock the back door. When I walked back through the kitchen, I finally saw what had been causing that feeling. In the window, there was a decrepit-looking man, appearing homeless. He was just standing there, staring into the window, looking directly at my cousin. At that moment, my instincts kicked in. I acted like I hadn't noticed him and calmly told my cousin that we should head upstairs because our parents would be home soon, and they wouldn't want him staying up too late. We went upstairs, and I put him to bed, fully aware that there was a man outside who wanted to get in. I was about 125 pounds and tall for my age, and I played football for my school, so I wasn't exactly helpless. I went back downstairs, straight into the kitchen, and grabbed a meat tenderizing hammer. When I looked back at the window where I had seen the man, he was gone. I rushed to the front door and checked that it was locked, both the deadbolt and the knob. Then, I sprinted back upstairs with the meat tenderizer in hand and went into my cousin's room. I sat down in front of the door. My cousin asked me what I was doing, and I told him not to worry about it and to keep his head down. I called the police, then my dad and uncle. The cops said they'd take about half an hour to arrive, and my dad and uncle were about 45 minutes away. Suddenly, I heard a window shatter downstairs and the heavy sound of boots walking on the main floor. I told my cousin to stay calm, hide under the covers, and keep completely silent. I could hear the man moving around downstairs. It was terrifying. I gripped the meat tenderizer tightly and waited. About 5 minutes later, I heard the boots moving up the stairs. My heart was racing. My cousin's door was only about 10 feet from the stairs. The man started opening doors, first my aunt and uncle's room, then the bathroom. After what felt like forever, I heard him walk back downstairs, and then he opened the door to the basement. 15 minutes later, the police arrived and burst into the house. It turned out the man had escaped from a mental hospital in the neighboring province. I was staying at an Airbnb for work for about 7 months. The very first night there, the upstairs bedroom door would unlatch, open, and I could hear what sounded like someone walking down the stairs. But when I looked, nobody was there. After the second time, I decided to check the entire house. I looked under the beds, in the closets, and absolutely everywhere. Still, I found nothing. I was petrified and almost left, but I figured that if whatever it was wanted to hurt me, it already could have. So, I apologized for intruding and asked if we could find a way to get along. After that, everything stopped for the night. For the next month or so, whenever I came home, I'd say, "Hello, I'm home." And for the most part, nothing much happened. Occasionally, I'd see large shadows out of the corner of my eye, and things would be moved around, but otherwise everything felt manageable. Things were going back to normal, and over time, I fell out of the habit of acknowledging whatever was there when I came home. I also stopped keeping the house as clean as I did in the beginning. At first, the ghost seemed cool when I was being respectful, but once I started acting like I was the only person living there, it seemed to irritate him. Apparently, I wasn't the best roommate, and he let me know. One night, I was jolted awake by loud crashing, banging, and slamming noises coming from the kitchen. I hadn't cleaned up after making dinner, and it must have upset him. When I went to the kitchen, nothing was out of place. Everything looked undisturbed, but as soon as I laid back down, the noise started again. This time, as I lay there, my entire body began to burn. It felt exactly like being under one of those red heat lamps used to keep baby chicks warm before they grow feathers. My body heated up to the point where it was unbearable, and the burning sensation was awful. I finally yelled out, asking it to stop, and in an instant, everything did. The noise, the burning, everything just stopped. After that, I made sure to say hello whenever I got home, and I cleaned up every night. There were almost no other interactions after that, but I always knew he was still there. I had gone through a pretty rough divorce a few months ago. For the 2 years my ex and I were married, most of our nights ended up turning into shouting matches and insults. We were always so loud that we got several noise complaints, and eventually we were given an ultimatum: get it together or we'd be thrown out of the building. Eventually we ended things and she got most of everything. The house belonged to her family, along with nearly everything inside it. All she let me take were my clothes, some photos, and my dog, Riley. I was short on money at the time, but luckily, A friend let me stay at his place for as long as I needed. While I was there, I searched for a better-paying job to help me get my life back on track. My search led me to an opening for a campus security guard at the local community college. When I arrived at the interview, I learned that it was a night shift job. I wasn't too sure about taking it at first, but my bills and growing debts weren't going to pay themselves. Needless to say, I started the next night. The campus was a decent size, both in area and the number of students. It included 14 educational and auxiliary buildings. The security office was by the south entrance, located on the second floor of the parking garage. 2 senior security guards, James and Darnell, walked me through my responsibilities. Every night, I had to do 2 full sweeps of the campus, checking all the buildings and monitoring the security cameras. My shift ran from 9:30 p.m. to 6 a.m., after which I'd take the bus home. The job itself wasn't bad. I even formed a bit of a friendship with James and Darnell since our shifts overlapped for a short time. By midnight, they'd both leave, and I'd be alone on campus. It was surreal how a place that was usually bustling with students could suddenly be so silent and empty. There were typically a few cars left in the lot from evening classes, and sometimes an instructor or staff member would work late, but those instances were rare. Most nights, I hardly interacted with anyone besides my coworkers. When things were quiet, I'd sometimes read a book or listen to spooky stories on my phone during breaks. Admittedly, those stories would sometimes make me feel uneasy about being alone on campus at night, but I got used to it. It helped pass the time until my next round of checks. I never found anything unusual, aside from the occasional item left behind by a student, which I'd return to the lost and found. My main job was to ensure no one was hanging around after hours. After each circuit, I'd return to the office to review the security footage in case I missed something. There were a few screens showing the areas with the most daytime activity. 1 for each parking lot, 1 for each building floor, and 1 for the administrative office. The pay was decent, and after a while, I was able to move out of my friend's house and into a small apartment. I even started saving up for a used car. Felt like my luck was finally turning around. Then, I had the scariest experience of my life. It was around midnight, and like usual, I was left alone. The campus was completely deserted. It was summer, so the night was warm, and I was starting to sweat a bit in my security uniform during my first round of checks. After completing the circuit and finding nothing of note, I returned to the office and checked the camera feed. At first, there was nothing on any of the screens, but then I saw something strange on the one showing the south lot near the office. A large shadow was moving across one of the lamp posts, back and forth. It didn't seem like it could have been from a bird or animal. It was too big. I figured someone might be parked just out of the camera's view. So I went out to check, but there was nothing. If someone had been there, they would have left some trace. Footprints, a car driving off, but I found nothing. I even scoped out the rest of the lot, but still nothing. I sighed, irritated at the thought of someone messing with me. The rest of the night was uneventful. Sleeping during the day had become a routine, but my cheap couch was far from comfortable. On top of that, my apartment's AC had stopped working, so I wasn't getting much rest. The heat made it harder to sleep, and when I showed up for my next shift, I had maybe 4 or 5 hours of sleep. Coffee only helped for so long. By the time it got really late, the cool office and quiet campus made me drowsy. Sleeping on the job wasn't allowed, but I would sometimes take brief naps to recharge. I set my head on the desk and immediately fell asleep. I was jolted awake sometime later. Something felt wrong, like an alarm going off in my head. Rubbing my eyes, I checked the monitors. My eyes narrowed when I saw something on the camera feed for the south lot. There, standing under one of the lamps, was a person. They weren't doing anything, just standing still. I couldn't make out any details, but they had long black hair and seemed abnormally tall, almost reaching the light. The camera was still recording, so whoever it was, they were still out there. A cold, creeping dread came over me. My body reacted instinctively, as if sensing danger. But I knew I had a job to do, so I went outside to investigate. I reached the lot in under a minute and saw the person standing exactly where they had been on the camera. They had their back to me, head bowed forward. As I got closer, I realized this figure was unnaturally tall and thin, and they were wearing a dirty white dress. I called out, asking if they needed help, but there was no response. They didn't move, didn't acknowledge me. I reached out to touch them, but the moment my hand made contact, I recoiled. Their skin was burning hot, like touching a stove. I stepped back, shaking my hand in pain, and that's when they moved. Slowly, they lifted their head, and I froze. As they turned around, I started backing away. What I saw wasn't human. The body was, but the head, it was that of a goat or ram. Black fur contrasted against pale skin, and its eyes glowed red like embers. Flesh hung from its curved horns, and as it moved toward me, it let out a deep, bone-chilling roar. I turned and ran. I raced back to the office, the sound of its footsteps pounding behind me. Once inside, I slammed the door shut and locked it. I quickly called 911, telling them something was on campus. They sent someone over, and I waited in the dark, heart racing. It felt like forever before I heard a knock. The police arrived, and I cautiously opened the door. I explained what had happened, but they didn't believe me. They probably thought I was crazy or on something. I played the footage for them, showing the thing on camera. At least they weren't going to arrest me for making a fake emergency call. But with the intruder gone, there wasn't much they could do. They left, and once again I was alone. Only this time I wasn't just alone, I was terrified. I didn't feel safe, not with the possibility that thing was still out there. I wasn't taking any chances. I stayed in the office, door locked, until my shift ended. I found the doll at a tag sale, hidden under a pile of worn stuffed animals and Barbie dolls with bad haircuts. She was tall, about 18 inches, and had curly black hair that turned bluish in the sunlight. Her eyes were green, and her lids opened and closed when tilted. She reminded me of the dolls my grandma used to collect. As a kid, I spent weekends at her house and always begged to play with them, but she'd say they were only for display. Now, at 25, I was buying a porcelain doll at a yard sale, fulfilling that childhood wish. Odd, I know, but I felt like the doll was meant for me. She even looked like me, minus the Victorian dress, replaced with blue jeans and a t-shirt. After taking her home, I cleaned the dirt marks from her face and arms. I stared at her for a while, unsure of what to do next. I could play with her now. There was no one to stop me, but I realized I didn't know how anymore. I wasn't a child, and playing with dolls didn't come naturally like it used to. I thought about just placing her on a shelf and leaving it at that. I should have. I really wish I had. But instead, I started tilting her from side to side, like a child might pretend a toy is walking. I made her walk over to a small elephant figurine on my side table and, without thinking, I had her kick it over. Fortunately, the living room was carpeted, so the elephant only lost an ear. Stunned, I quickly set the doll down on the couch and picked up the figurine, cradling it as though apologizing. I couldn't explain why I had done that. I set the elephant back in place and took the doll to my room, placing her on the rocking chair beside my bed, and then left to make dinner, pushing the odd moment out of my mind. That night, when I went to bed, I only gave her a passing glance before getting under the covers. There she sat, peacefully on the chair, her eyes closed. I sat up. Closed? I tried to remember if they'd been shut when I set her down. Her lids could have easily closed as I carried her. I probably just hadn't noticed. I lay back down and turned off the light, telling myself it was late and I was tired. I drifted off without much trouble. I've always been someone who falls asleep easily. Hours later, I woke up suddenly and groggily looked at the clock. It was 2 a.m. I had 4 more hours before my alarm would go off. As I turned over, I realized I needed to use the bathroom. I turned on the light and groaned as my eyes adjusted, but once they did, I found myself staring straight into the green eyes of the doll. Squeezing my eyes shut and opening them again, but her eyes still stared back at me. They had been closed. I knew that. I walked over to the chair, picked the doll up, and tilted her forward so her eyes closed again. Then, I tilted her back, and they opened. I repeated the motion several times, trying to understand how they could have opened on their own. There was no breeze in the room, the windows were shut, and the chair hadn't moved. I couldn't explain it. I set her back on the chair, ensuring her eyes were closed, and went to the bathroom. When I returned, I checked her again. Her eyes were still closed, just as I had left them. I smiled, reassuring myself that I had probably opened them earlier and was too tired to remember. Climbing back into bed, I turned off the light, but my eyes kept drifting to her face. To my horror, I watched as one eye slowly winked open and then shut again. I shook my head, convincing myself that I must be imagining it. I turned off the light and burrowed under the covers, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I curled up, trying to ignore the creeping sensation. I was an adult, after all, and I wasn't about to let a doll frighten me. I stayed wrapped tightly in the blankets until I started to relax, feeling the weight of sleep returning. And then I heard it. A soft creaking noise, the sound of my rocking chair moving back and forth. Slowly, I turned toward the chair, too afraid to turn on the light. The moonlight was just enough to see by. The doll was still seated there, staring at me as the chair rocked. At first, I thought the chair was moving by itself, but then I saw a pale figure crouched next to it, pushing it back and forth. I froze. The figure stood up. A little girl, around 6 or 7 years old, wearing an old-fashioned nightgown. Her black hair was tied in pigtails, and her pale face had dark circles under her eyes. She wasn't solid, I could just barely see through her. She wasn't alive. The girl tilted her head at me, as if inviting me to play. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I watched as she picked up the doll and hugged it close. How could she hold it? She shouldn't have been able to, but she did. Could she touch me too? The thought sent a shiver through me. She was just a little girl, but something about her felt deeply wrong. She took a couple of steps toward me, thrusting the doll forward. The doll's eyes began to blink wildly, and its mouth cracked open, unleashing an eerie, shrill laughter. I screamed. The little girl's face twisted into a grin, revealing sharp, bloody teeth. She threw the doll at me, laughing the same laugh that had come from the doll's mouth. As the doll flew toward me, its teeth snapping, I knew I had to do something. If the girl had come with the doll, maybe destroying it would send her away. I caught the doll and held it at arm's length, feeling it struggle in my grasp. I had to act fast. I dashed to the living room, barely keeping the doll under control as it twisted in my hands. I threw logs and newspapers into the fireplace and lit them. The doll fought harder, but I pinned it under my knee as I fumbled to get the fire going. The girl's laughter echoed through the hallway, growing louder with each second. Finally, the fire roared to life. I yanked the doll off the floor and hurled it into the flames. Its porcelain face shattered, and its cloth body ignited. A blood-curdling cry filled the house, the sound so loud it felt like it was coming from everywhere. I clutched my ears and crouched down, waiting for it to stop. Through the corner of my eye, I saw the little girl standing in front of the fireplace. She was more transparent now, her face contorted in pain. She reached for the doll, but her hands passed right through it. As the doll burned, the girl's body began to blacken, as though she too was burning. She turned to me, anger in her eyes, and started moving toward me, but her steps were slow and heavy. Her body continued to turn black with each step. I stood up, backing away, terrified. When I tripped over the couch, the girl leapt toward me, but before she could reach me, she dissolved into black smoke and disappeared. I sat there, trembling, waiting for her to return. After what felt like hours, I finally moved toward the fireplace. The flames had burned out, leaving only the shattered pieces of the doll. I gathered them up, not caring about the heat, and took them outside. I buried the pieces in the far corner of my yard, hoping that would put an end to it. It's been an hour since I buried the doll, but I still feel like I'm being watched. I don't know if she's really gone, and every now and then, I swear I can hear her laugh. Let me tell you about my dad's old farmhouse. We all called it the spooky house, and honestly, it earned the name. My dad grew up on dairy farms with his parents, who worked for a man that owned several farms. They moved around a lot, managing different properties. This was in Australia, so you can imagine some of the remote, rugged landscapes they lived in. But none of those places were as strange as the spooky house. Dad was in his late teens to early 20s when they lived there, and it didn't take long for the house to start making itself known to them. From the beginning, the place just felt wrong. You'd walk in and feel it like a heaviness in the air. It wasn't something you could easily explain, just a constant underlying sense that something was off. The house was old, with creaky wooden floors and walls that seemed to hold onto sounds far longer than they should. Dad said the floors were full of little notches and gaps, and my Nan would place stoppers in them to keep the wind from whistling up through the cracks. But the strangest thing was that every morning, they would wake up to find the stoppers pushed up from underneath, as if something beneath the house was trying to get in. Nan tried to brush it off as some sort of animal or perhaps the house settling, but Dad wasn't convinced. And neither was Nan, especially when other odd things began happening. In the doorways, they had these huge, heavy hippie beads that hung down, thick and solid. It would take a gust of wind to move them, or so they thought. Yet countless times, Dad would get up early in the morning to find the beads swaying gently, as if someone had just passed through them. But when he checked, everyone was still asleep in their rooms. As time went on, the house's unsettling energy seemed to grow stronger. It was almost like the house itself didn't want them there, like it was waiting for something. The tension in the air would build for days. Then there would be strange noises, scratches, thuds, whispers, and then silence. One particularly cold night, things took a turn for the worse. Nan, who had been silently growing more and more uneasy about the house, decided to call a psychic. She figured if anyone could explain what was going on, it would be someone who could see beyond what the rest of them could. So she made the call, hoping for answers. But when the psychic finally arrived, she didn't even get out of her car. She stopped at the end of the long dirt driveway, staring at the house, and refused to come closer. Nan walked up to her car and asked why she wouldn't come in. The psychic, pale and visibly shaken, told her, "There's something in there, something that doesn't want me in that house. You need to leave. Move out." "But what's in there? What are we dealing with?" The psychic shook her head, her voice trembling. "I don't know what it is, but it's not something I can help you with." With that, she drove off, leaving Nan standing there with no answers, just more questions. The fact that even a psychic refused to enter made the house seem even more sinister. Not long after that, strange things, Dad never liked to call them creatures, started showing up. They stalked the house at night, and none of them ever saw them directly, but they could sense them. Nan would wake up in the morning to find the grass around the house trampled down, especially near the windows. Whatever was out there had been circling the house in the dead of night, watching them. Her peg basket on the clothesline was ripped apart more than once, its pieces scattered across the yard. Nan would get irritated, mumbling about how she had to keep buying new ones, but that irritation soon turned into fear. Things started scratching at the windows at night, long, slow scrapes against the glass, as if whatever it was wanted them to know it was there. Dad told me he was always too scared to look. He knew, deep down, that if he did, something would be staring right back at him. In the mornings, they'd check the windows and see the paint scratched off at roughly human height. Grass beneath the windows would be flattened. One night, when my grandfather was working a few paddocks over, my Nan came into Dad's room, visibly shaken. She whispered, "It's back. It's outside." They huddled in his bedroom, too afraid to make a sound. The heavy atmosphere in the house felt even thicker that night as they listened to the sound of something moving around outside. It circled the house, slow and deliberate, its footsteps crunching the gravel with every pass. They sat there in silence, hearts pounding, until the first rays of dawn broke through. And then there was the time Dad experienced it firsthand. He was walking across the paddocks, heading to help his father with the cows in the early hours of the morning. The air was bitterly cold, the grass covered in frost. As he walked, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind him, crunching through the frozen grass. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, but when he stopped, the sound stopped too. He began walking again, and once more, he heard it, a steady crunch, crunch. Dad's pace quickened, and when he stopped a third time, the footsteps didn't. They were coming toward him. That was all it took for Dad to bolt. He ran across 2 paddocks, vaulted over fences without even thinking, and didn't stop until he reached his father's side. It wasn't always just his family who experienced strange things either. Whenever Dad's parents left for a few days, he would invite friends over for parties. They'd hang out, drink, and have the run of the place. But no matter how big the group, by the end of the night, everyone always ended up sleeping in the same room, as if they couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. One night, it was just Dad and his cousin, playing pool and drinking. It was around midnight, and they were both pretty drunk when, out of nowhere, a dark figure appeared at the edge of the room and said, "Go to bed." Being as drunk as they were, they didn't question it. They shrugged, "Why not?" and went to bed. The next morning, they woke up to find the pool game had been neatly packed away. Dad's cousin looked at him and asked, "Who was that guy standing over us while we slept?" The weirdness didn't stop there, though. They'd hear footsteps on the roof, like someone walking around up there. But when they checked, no one was ever there. Doors would slam shut by themselves, and strange, disembodied voices would call their names from dark corners of the house. Eventually, Dad and his parents had enough and decided to leave. Not long after they moved out, the house mysteriously caught fire and burned to the ground. To this day, Dad doesn't know what started the fire, but he was more than happy to see the place reduced to ashes. The house had been abandoned for 2 years before we bought it. From the outside, it didn't seem particularly unusual, just an old home that had seen better days. When we first went for the viewing, there was something strange about one of the bedrooms. The closet door was padlocked shut, secured with a barn door latch and a heavy lock. Curious, we asked the realtor about it, but she just shrugged, saying there was no key. She told us it couldn't be opened unless we bought the house. Well, we ended up buying it, and naturally, the first thing we wanted to do was open that door. There was something unsettling about a locked closet that no one could explain. So, the day we got the keys, priority number 1 was unlocking it. After a few minutes of wrestling with a pry bar, we managed to break through. What we found on the other side wasn't exactly what we expected, but it didn't make us feel any better. It was a child's play area. The walls were painted in bright, cheerful colors, and the ceiling was covered in glow-in-the-dark stick-on stars and planets. The floor was covered in checkered tiles, giving it an almost playful look, but there was something wrong. There were no lights, no air vents, no windows. The room felt sealed, like it wasn't meant to be opened or used. My little brother, who had tagged along, took one look at it and with a mischievous grin said, "Well, this must be where they kept the kids before they died." We all laughed it off. Fast forward a few months, and the house was well into renovation. We had torn down walls, painted rooms, and tried to make the place feel like a home. One thing that kept happening, though, was the light in the loft. We had installed a daylight-sensing motion sensor light there because it was difficult to set up a proper switch. But for some reason, the light would turn on by itself at all hours of the day. No matter how we positioned the sensor, it would randomly trip, casting an eerie glow in the loft at the most unexpected moments. At first, it was annoying, but soon it became a running joke. Every time it happened, one of us would shout, "Will you darn kids quit running in the house?" And weirdly enough, after that, the light would stay off for the rest of the day. About a year into living there, the house had started to feel like our own, despite the occasional weirdness. The creepy closet room had been transformed into our computer room, and we used it regularly without much thought. My wife and I left for work at the same time each day, but she always came home a couple of hours before I did. One day, I got a call from her, and she sounded genuinely confused. "Why did you come back home earlier today?" she asked. I hadn't. I told her I'd been at work all day, but she insisted that when she walked into the house, the chair from the computer room was in the kitchen. Now, the chair wasn't lightweight or easy to move, and it would have had to travel through 2 doorways, down a hallway, and down a flight of stairs to reach the kitchen. I hadn't moved it, and she certainly hadn't either. The thought of it moving by itself was unsettling, but we joked about it, blaming the dead kids for pulling a prank on us. "Those heathen kids," we said, laughing nervously. 6 months later, the weirdness peaked. We went to bed one night with everything in its usual place, the house quiet and calm. But when we woke up, we found something bizarre waiting for us in the kitchen. All of our kitchen knives had been removed from the butcher block. In their place were butter knives. The sharp, dangerous knives had been carefully placed behind the sink, as if someone had thoughtfully swapped them out. My wife and I hadn't touched them, and there was no logical explanation for how or why it had happened. We were both spooked and decided to spend the entire day out of the house, trying to clear our minds. We told ourselves we were being ridiculous. Ghosts aren't real, and there definitely weren't any dead kids in the house. But then one day, I got talking to our neighbor, an older gentleman who had lived on the street for decades. Casually, I asked him if he knew anything about the previous owners. That's when he dropped a bombshell. No children had died in the house, but a grown man had. The room with the creepy closet, the one we had turned into our computer room, that's where the previous owner's brother had committed suicide. He had been going through a rough time after his wife left him, and he just couldn't handle it anymore. He cut his wrists in that room and bled out. The previous owner, his brother, continued to live in the house for a while after that. But when he was foreclosed on, he attempted to take his own life in the same room. Thankfully, his children found him in time and he survived. It all started to make sense in a chilling sort of way. The strange lights, the moving chair, the rearranged knives. Maybe it wasn't kids haunting the house after all. Maybe it was something darker, something tied to the tragedy that had unfolded in that room. Later that year, our family grew, and we had to rearrange the rooms to make space for the baby. The creepy closet room? It was emptied out and left as storage. And strangely enough, once we stopped using that room, all the odd happenings came to an end. The lights stopped flickering on their own. The furniture stayed in place, and the kitchen knives remained where they belonged. 9 years have passed since we moved in, and the house has been peaceful ever since. We still use that room for storage, but our son, who's now 4, plays in there occasionally. Despite the bright daylight that floods through the windows, he always insists on turning every light on before he plays. When I asked him why, he just shrugged and said, "It makes it less weird to play in there." When my husband and I rented an old house, we knew it would need a lot of work. It was one of those places that had clearly been neglected for years. The walls were covered in outdated, peeling wallpaper, and the ceiling had the dreaded popcorn texture. Worse yet, the basement had been vandalized by the teenagers who lived there before. Swastikas were crudely spray-painted on the walls, a sick reminder of the kind of energy this house had absorbed. Still, it was affordable and we needed a home, especially with our baby boy coming home soon after being born prematurely. He spent nearly 5 months in the NICU, and we wanted everything to be perfect for him. We spent weeks fixing up the house. We stripped the wallpaper, painted the walls, and removed the popcorn ceiling. Every day was a project, and we felt a sense of accomplishment as the house slowly transformed from a grim, haunted place into a livable space. But no matter how much we worked, something always felt off, like the house itself resented us for trying to change it. The basement was the worst. We didn't bother fixing it up. The vandalism, the swastikas, and the mess left by the previous occupants were too much to deal with. Besides, we didn't need the extra room, and there was no way I was spending more time down there than necessary. The one time I went down there was enough to convince me to stay out for good. The air was thick, suffocating even, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was down there with me, angry that I had invaded its space. That same unsettling feeling didn't stay confined to the basement. Sometimes it seemed to seep into the rest of the house, like a dark shadow creeping up the stairs. It would start with a feeling of being watched. I'd feel eyes on me, cold and heavy, and the room would seem to grow darker. At first, I convinced myself it was just my imagination, that my mind was playing tricks on me because of how creepy the basement was. But it kept happening, and eventually, I couldn't ignore it. Whenever the air felt too thick, too suffocating, I'd take the baby and sit in the car while my husband burned sage throughout the house, trying to clear the energy. He hated doing it, Every time he lit the sage, he said the air became almost unbearable, heavy with a rage that wasn't ours. He told me he'd see shadowy figures moving toward him, like they were trying to escape through the smoke. He'd feel them pushing against him, angry, trying to shove him out of the house. Even though the sage would help for a while, the darkness always seemed to creep back in after a week or two, like it had only retreated temporarily, gathering its strength for the next encounter. There were so many strange and unexplainable things that happened in that house. But two incidents stand out the most, burned into my memory like a bad dream I can't forget. One day, I was taking a shower while my son sat in his little bouncer seat in the bathroom doorway. He was always so peaceful, content to sit and watch me while I hurried through my routine. I had just finished rinsing off and pulled the shower curtain open when I heard a sound. A sharp, clattering noise behind me. In an instant, I saw the can of air freshener, which had been sitting securely on the back of the toilet, fly across the room, headed straight for my baby. My heart stopped. If the bathroom door hadn't been slightly ajar, the can would have hit him square in the head. I lost it. I started screaming at whatever was in the house. I didn't care if it heard me. "If you're going to mess with someone, mess with me," I yelled. "Leave my baby alone." As if on cue, the detachable shower head that had been hanging securely on its hook suddenly broke free. It whipped through the air with a speed that sent it crashing into the side of the tub, the end of its cord still attached, swinging dangerously close to my head. That shut me up real fast. My heart raced and I could barely breathe. Whatever was in the house wasn't just watching us. It was angry, and it didn't like me standing up to it. The second experience happened at night when my husband and I were in bed. Our son was fast asleep in his room down the hall. He was still on oxygen, and we had a pulse oximeter monitoring his levels. Because of that, we always kept a baby monitor nearby so we could hear if the alarm went off. It had become part of our nightly routine. We'd lay in bed, talk for a while, and then say our goodnights before drifting off to sleep. On this particular night, we had just finished talking and had said goodnight when, not even 5 minutes later, we both heard it. Clear as day, the sound of a little girl's laughter came through the baby monitor. It was soft, high-pitched, and chilling. My husband leapt out of bed, ready to confront whoever was in the house. But I knew, deep down, there was no one there. My body froze, couldn't move, couldn't speak. I was paralyzed by fear, unable to shake the sound of that laugh. It was so innocent yet so impossibly wrong. I stayed in bed, stunned, until sleep finally claimed me. I don't miss that house. I don't miss the creeping shadows, the heavy air, or the constant feeling of being watched. My mom was in the hospital 50 miles away, battling what we believed might be her final days. I was only 19 at the time. We weren't sure how much longer she had, and the weight of that reality was heavy on my mind. My dad stayed by her side at the hospital, leaving me alone in the house. Their home was large, too large for one person, especially someone like me who always felt uneasy being alone. It stood isolated from any neighboring houses, tucked away on a small lagoon, far off the main road. The darkness that surrounded the house at night always gave me chills. That night, I went to bed around 1 a.m. I was messing around on my laptop, playing games and trying to distract myself from the gloomy thoughts of my mom's condition. My room was located in a separate wing of the house. The entire wing could be sealed off with a single locking door, though I hadn't locked it. Despite my usual fears, I tried to keep calm by keeping all the lights on in my wing, every single one, from the hallway lights to the closet. The dim glow from the closet always gave me some comfort, making the space feel just a little less eerie. As I was browsing game FAQs, something strange happened. All of the lights in my wing shut off at once. The band of light under the door, the only thing that reassured me, suddenly went black. My heart dropped into my stomach. I sat up in bed, frozen for a moment, staring at the door as though it held all the answers. The bedroom door was unlocked, and though I felt a strong urge to get up and lock it, fear kept me still. Before I could make a decision, the door slammed violently. It wasn't a gentle close. It was as if someone had kicked the bottom of the door with full force. I remember letting out a small, involuntary squeak of shock. It took me about 6 seconds to spring into action. I jumped to my feet and grabbed a blade I kept by my bedside, positioned only a few paces away from the door. I remember thinking that if the door opened, I would be ready to face whoever or whatever was on the other side. But the complete silence that followed was unnerving. What troubled me most was the absence of light beneath the door. Without it, I couldn't see the shadow of anyone standing outside. My imagination ran wild, picturing some dark figure standing in the hallway, waiting for the right moment to strike. Several minutes passed, and nothing happened. My mind wrestled with itself. Fear was urging me to stay hidden, but my instincts told me I couldn't sit still forever. I didn't have a phone in my room. My old Nokia was charging in another wing of the house, completely out of reach. So, with nothing but a knife in my hand and misplaced courage, I made my move. I threw the door open with a surge of adrenaline, my knife held low in my right hand, and my left arm up in a defensive position. I was ready for a confrontation, but there was nothing, just empty air. The hallway was still eerily quiet. Confused, I quickly flipped the hallway light switch, expecting some explanation, but found none. There was no one in my wing, no one in the entire house. The burglar alarm was still on and undisturbed. Every window and door was locked as it had been earlier. I searched every corner, under beds, in closets, behind furniture. Nothing. I felt a chill run down my spine as I stood in the now brightly lit hallway, my mind racing with questions. There was no explanation for what had happened. Slowly, I backed into my room, locking the door and sealing myself off once more. I left the lights on this time and sat on my bed, laptop still open but forgotten. I kept glancing at the door, which now had a slight bow in it, a lasting reminder of the violent force that had slammed it shut earlier. Hours dragged by and sleep was impossible. Around 3 a.m., the lights under the door dimmed again. My heart pounded in my chest. The entire wing was in darkness once more, and this time I was truly terrified. My knife, which had seemed like a decent form of defense earlier, now felt utterly useless. The reality of the situation began to sink in, and my previous bravery evaporated. Without thinking, I grabbed the bed and shoved it against the door. It was heavy, and moving it wasn't easy, but the effort felt necessary. The door opened inward, so I figured this would at least buy me some time if something, or someone, tried to get in. As I stood there, I felt a shift in the air. It was subtle, but it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It felt as though something was angry with me, though I had no idea why. In a panic, I retreated to the closet, the place that always felt safest to me as a child. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, surrounded by my clothes, my back pressed against the wall. Every creak in the house sent my imagination spiraling. Was there something on the other side of the door? I stayed like that until the sky started to lighten. The first rays of sunlight came through the skylight, casting a pale glow across the room. That was all I needed to find the strength to move. My fear seemed to dissolve as the daylight took over, and I finally pushed the bed away from the door. When I stepped out of my room, I noticed something odd. The wing door had been unlocked, but that wasn't possible. It required a key from the other side. I had locked it myself after the first incident. Just then, I heard footsteps coming down the stairs from the main part of the house. My dad was home. For a moment, I felt embarrassed, thinking I had made a big deal out of nothing. "Oh," I said, trying to laugh it off. "So it was you who turned all the lights off last night?" He gave me a strange look and replied, "What? I just got home 10 minutes ago." My stomach dropped. There was no explanation for what had happened that night. No logical reason. I still don't know what it was, but whatever it was, it seemed to like the dark and had a thing against doors. And it only ever seemed to appear in my wing of the house. Almost 20 years have passed since that night, and nothing like it ever happened again. My parents built the house from scratch, and no strange or tragic events had ever occurred there. Yet every time I visit, I see that bow in my bedroom door. It's still there, while my sister's door across the hall remains perfectly flush, just as it was when it was first installed. And despite everything, my mom is still with us,